Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm not sure how many already joined this webinar, but this webinar would be on Introduction to Data Envelopment Analysis and the use of DEA in regulations. I'm just checking to see if the participants are already joined, and then we will start in a few seconds. Yeah, we have 49 participants already. Okay, let's start. It's a little bit pity that on this very nice afternoon, very sunshine that we presented inside. This conference meant to be at Warwick University this year. And well, actually, I'm living close to Warwick University. But it's pity that we have to run it in a virtual presentation. But the advantage is, on the other hand, the OR Society received a lot of registrations. As far as I know, over 1,300 registration for this conference. Okay, for those who just joined on this webinar now, this is about data envelopment analysis, an introduction to DEA, and the use of DEA in regulation with the demonstration of the PIM-DEA software. Not sure how many of you knows about DEA, but DEA initially started in 1978. That is a linear programming that has been developed by Charles Cooper Rhodes as a way to measure the efficiency of decision-making units. And when we talk about decision-making units, it means like banks or hospitals or any other decision-making units that we can define some resources and we can define some output of the decision-making units. Say, for example, in the banks, the number of staff is one of the inputs to decision-making units to the banks, and the number of accounts, for example, is the output of the bank. In hospital, for example, the number of doctors and nurses are the input. The number of inpatient and outpatients are output to the hospitals. So DEA make it possible to compare the operating units, any of these decision-making units, in order to find the relative efficiency against each other. This is relative efficiency because DEA compare each DMU against a set of other DMUs in the data set. So obviously, if the data set is changed, the relative efficiency may also be changed. The initial development of the DEA, we had two main models called input-oriented and output-oriented efficiency. And these two models are the way that we can focus on the maximization of the possible output levels or minimization of input levels. So the output-oriented, we maximize the output while we keep the level of the input constant. On the input-oriented model, we minimize the input while we keep the output level constant. Of course, after now nearly 40 few years after DEA, there are a lot of other models, non-oriented model, directional distance functions, etc. But these two are the main models that initially been developed in DEA. I give you one example, a very short example on what the DEA, just get an idea what DEA is. Consider these 6 decision-making units. These are 6 hospitals. We have 2 inputs, nurses, we have 1 input, nurses, and 2 output, outpatient and inpatient. So basically, we measure the efficiency of the nurses against the services they provide to inpatient and outpatient unit. On DEA, we can define a boundary, which we call it efficient boundary, and then we can compare inefficient DMUs against the boundary, like H01 in this case, against the boundary, which is H02 and H03. This is the way that we measure DEA and the output-oriented model. Simply, or similar model, we can also measure the efficiency of DMU when we consider the input-oriented. In this example, we have two inputs, doctor and nurses, and outpatient as outputs. So basically, we compare the hospital in order to see if it's possible to reduce the number of doctors and nurses. DEA by itself is a linear programming. It's simple, it initially been developed, and so it attracts many, many applications. When you look on the publication of the DEA, there are over 15,000 papers published. Only last year, there are 1,434 papers published. This bibliography is available if you want to download it. And of course, in terms of the theory of the DEA applications, there are journals like European Journal, Journal of Operational Research Society, Analysis of Operations. These are the main journal publishing DEA papers. And because of its usefulness in various areas of application, DEA applied to many, many types of applications, including business management, decision sciences, computer science, economics, engineering, etc. As you can see in this list of the pie chart you can see. One of the applications that is used by many companies is application of the DEA in regulations. And in the next 30-40 minutes, we have Professor Emmanuel Tanasoulis from Aston University and Dr. Shirini from Auxira that will present an application of the DEA in regulations. So I invite Emmanuel to join and start the presentation.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
And I don't know if my video should be on as well.
Yes, it's on. And
okay.
Can you put, Emmanuel, your PPT on the show, please?
I think the first speaker of the DEA use in regulation is going to be actually Srini. So I will ask you, Srini, you are muted at the moment. Do you want for me to run the slides, or will you put on the slides yourself? Because the first part of the presentation will be Srini. Okay, I can see it on already, so it's Srini. So the only thing, Srini, you're muted at the moment.
I'm sorry, I'm a bit stuck this end. For some reason, we did all the testing and I can't seem to share the presentation.
We have to stop the presentation. So Shirini can...
hopefully you can see me now.
We can see you, yeah. Shall I put on the presentation?
Yes, please, if you don't mind. Apologies.
Okay, let me put on. Oh, it says we'll stop other person's screen sharing. So Ali, would you stop?
Yes, I already stopped at the moment.
Okay, so share. So can you everybody see now? A frontier. So I will go further back. Okay. Can you see all that?
Yes, we can. And if you can go to the next slide, Emmanuel.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Ali, for the nice interaction to DEA, and afternoon, everyone. I'm Srini Parthasarathi. I'm a partner at Auxira and head of its efficiency practice. Auxira is an economic consultancy firm. We are based in 8 European countries. This presentation is in 2 parts. So my presentation is going to be a bit conceptual. It will be a bit abstract. And what I intend to do is to provide you all with an overview of how efficiency analysis fits in regulation. And Emmanuel will follow it up with his idea on how incentives can be used to strengthen, stimulate, efficient behavior. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with regulatory work, but in general, regulation is seen as a weak and a temporary substitution for competition. One of the objectives of regulation is to mimic competitive pressures. Efficiency analysis is one way of doing that, as Emmanuel explained, whether using DEA or any other efficiency methods. one is able to identify best practice, and the regulator can use that information and set targets on the industry to kind of adapt these best practices. In the interest of time, my presentation is going to be quite brief and quite high level. But of course, we welcome questions at the end of the talk. And of course, you can reach out to us post the presentation or the conference as well. You can find my contact details on the website. So, I mean, as you can see on this slide, this is the broad schematic of how efficiency analysis figures in regulation. You can call it a schematic or a building block or a step-by-step guide to efficiency work in regulation. We start with framework considerations, which provide the broader context within which efficiency is applied. Then, we'll be discussing model development, which I presume we all understand very well. It's about identifying the relevant inputs and outputs of a model, and also identifying a sensible relationship linking the two. We will move on to methodology, which is about the efficiency method. It can be data envelopment analysis, it can be stochastic frontier analysis, or it can be any quantitative methods or a combination of methods. We will then move on to model validation. This is a real-life application, so every data point matters. It is even a percentage point difference could amount to millions of dollars or pounds, and could affect the financeability of a regulated entity, or it could mean increase in tariffs for consumers. And lastly, it's about calibration of results, which is about how regulators bring results from multiple evidence base together. Manuel, if you can go to the next slide, please. So, when it comes to framework considerations, so this is where the legal requirements, the regulatory duties, and the regulatory objectives, they provide the broader context for efficiency work. So, for example, if you take German energy regulation, the regulator or the consultants of the regulator, or for the companies, they have to apply methods which are consistent with state-of-the-art scientific literature. So that is a legal requirement. And if you look at Norwegian energy regulation, the regulator's objective or focus is more on strengthening the incentives of the sector as a whole, rather than identifying precise estimates of efficiency. Now, as we know, different approaches can provide different outcomes, but they should be aligned with the broader context. So if a regulator is interested in consolidating the sector because it is very fragmented, so the method that is used should be able to provide an estimate of scale efficiency, for example. So that could be used by the regulator. Now, when it comes to key constraints of efficiency applications, they are predominantly three. The first one is the maturity of the sector. The second one is data availability and quality, which is in a way linked to the industry structure and maturity. And lastly, it's the time and resources commitments. But it is despite these constraints, it's always feasible and sensible to apply some efficiency analysis to understand the state of the sector. It can help help the regulator understand what even if the results are not used, what the data issues are, and how the data guidance can be strengthened, for example. So moving on to the next component, which is model development. This is the most important step in efficiency work, and more so than the methodology, the method use itself. Now, there are several considerations. I'm not going to take you through all of them, so if I can just focus on two. The first one is, there is a wide understanding and appreciation that these economic models are simplified versions of complex reality. So we are trying to represent the operations of a transmission operator, or a water company, or a telecoms operator through parsimonious inputs and outputs. So, clearly there are inherent limitations of such an exercise, and that's kind of well understood. Now, given again the real life applications of these tools, what it also means is that typically economics and operational evidence, they are given more importance than statistics, which underpin certain assumptions and require certain conditions to be met to be properly inferred. Another point I would like to make is, so there's model development through which you identify the relevant inputs and outputs and the relationship between the two. They don't happen in isolation or in a vacuum. Best practice, regulatory best practice suggests that there has to be, a transparent engagement process between the stakeholders, which can actually mitigate information asymmetry, build trust in the system, and improve the overall quality of assessment. I will show you, a specific regulatory model before I hand over to Emmanuel later on. So, next slide, Emmanuel. Thanks. So the third step is the methodology. I mean, this can be, as I said, DEA or SFA or any quantitative method, and this is less intensive than the other steps, and that's because typically regulators consider multiple approaches with the understanding that different approaches underpin different assumptions, so the results should not be skewed or biased because of assumptions underpinning a particular approach. Now, if one specific observation, if I can make, is, if you look for common ground in terms of methods used by regulators, there is very little common ground amongst European regulators. They tend to be driven by the academic regulators, the academic advisors to the regulators, or the consultants and their preferences in a way. So you can see that in some cases there is outright rejection of certain methods, which is less than ideal. And the last point would be that given the practical applications and the compromises you end up making, operational evidence, business analysis could provide useful cross-checks to top-down analysis. Next slide. Yeah. So model validation, as I said, there's a need to get every data point correct. And so model validation involves genuine exploration of the building blocks of the analysis, stress testing every assumptions that are made in the process. So robustness check, sensitivity analysis are a must to ensure that the outcomes are not, purely coincidental. And in doing so, the model validation approach should not be arbitrary. There's a need to ensure that there is a strong theoretical basis or foundation for model validation. I say that because in some regulatory applications, you can still see that a second stage analysis is used for model validation, which is insufficient and in many cases flawed. And the last step, if the next slide, please. So this would be calibration. So this is where results from multiple models, multiple methods are brought together by a regulator, and different regulators have taken different paths here. Some regulators explicitly quantify a margin of error to be attached to the results. Some regulators focus on identifying precise estimates of efficiency. Others focus on strengthening incentives. Now, clearly, this process is highly contextual, so they need to be considered at both the industry level as well as at the company level. So, for example, if you go for a benefit of doubt approach, that could be overly generous for some companies at the detriment of its consumers. Or if you choose to apply equal weight to different, evidence bases, then that may be inappropriate and could result in a financial or financeability risk for a firm. So then I come on to my last slide. So, if you ask me to characterize efficiency work in benchmarking, I would call it an ongoing journey among stakeholders. And there is a need for balanced consideration of encouraging efficient investments, achieving cost control and achieving the right consumer outcomes. And one of the key objectives of such an exercise must be learning and sharing of best practice. So Emmanuel, can you skip a couple of slides and get to the model? I think we can skip these slides. Yeah, so if you go one slide back. So Yeah, so this is one of the models which is actually used by the German energy regulator. So here at the German energy regulator, they use both DEA and SFA for efficiency work. And the input is total expenditure, which is a combination of controllable operating expenditure and capital expenditure. They define TOTEX in two different ways. And as you can see, the outputs have differed over two regulatory periods, slightly so, and there are about 11 outputs used by the regulator as part of their model. And if you can go to the next slide, Emmanuel. So this is where you can see how the regulatory formula works. And you can see that the two efficiency factors figure in the regulatory formula explicitly. One is the catch-up factor, which is the gap to best practice. The other one is the productivity factor, which is the score for the best practice to improve over time. As you can see, the regulatory revenue formula explicitly relies on these two factors, and there's a need to get these two factors correct. So that's it from me. Thanks for listening. Apologies if that was a bit rushed, but we have time towards the end to discuss questions. Over to you, Emmanuel. Thanks so much for being here.
Okay, thank you. I don't know whether I have control of the video. The host has asked you to start video. Okay. Right. Thank you, Srini, for that. And I'm going to pick up from one part of what Srini mentioned and essentially present a research paper which draws on regulation to present a more general approach to incentivizing operating units to improve efficiency in a case where there is an asymmetry of information between the center that controls the units and the operating units. The paper, you can see there, it appeared last year, and it's joint work with Mohsen Afsharian and Heinz from the Technical University at Braunschweig in Germany. The underlying motivation for the work is that in regulation, you have the regulator on the one hand, who is safeguarding the interests of the consumers, and the companies on the other side, who obviously, they may be socially minded, but their main stakeholders are the owners for whom they want to maximize profit. Now, in this situation, obviously, there is a conflict, so to speak, of interest. And there is an asymmetry of information in the sense that the companies, the operating units, know exactly how it is possible to operate in order to be efficient. They run the companies. And the regulator doesn't have as much information about what would really be efficient at company level. So needs to incentivize companies in order to reveal efficient practices. But there is a moral hazard for the companies. If they reveal efficient information, that efficient information then in the regulatory system is built into the process, and the regulator would demand more and more efficiency. So this was addressed already in papers by Borgetoft and Grell and others, and they come up with a formula in essence to incentivize companies where the revenue that you saw the formula earlier on for Germany, for example, the revenue, C star, that you permit a company in order to deliver the services that it does deliver, would be equal to what you observed the cost to be there, plus a factor O, which is subjective by the regulator, but let's call it 1 for the moment, so it's as if it's not there. Theta is the efficiency that you derive for the company minus 1, multiplied by the observed cost of the company. So if you imagine the efficiency of the company, let's say to be 0.8 for theta, this would be 0.2 when you make the subtraction. So in effect, if you keep this at 1, you would be subtracting 20% of the observed cost as what you set the efficient cost to be for the company going forward. So you'd be asking 20% efficiency savings. However, what they are suggesting in order to incentivize companies is that that may not be a very good idea, because what that means is if you see this graph, for example, where you have the companies delivering two outputs and they're using one input cost, let's say operating expenditure, and this here can be the number of connections you have to the system. If this is, let's say, an electricity delivery system or a water delivery system, and this output, the length of the mains that are maintained, so two outputs, then the more efficient companies would be the ones out there on the frontier because they would have the largest output levels per unit input. This graph is per unit input. And of course, when you require companies to be efficient, you're forcing them to go to the frontier, but then that frontier becomes the reference point for the regulator, and the regulator then would expect that frontier to move even further and further from the origin, requiring even more and more cost reductions. So there is this moral hazard for companies not to reveal efficient practices. However, what the paper that I suggested, the formula that I repeat down here again, would do is this. Suppose you were to actually assess companies in the form of super efficiency. So if you assume your data point was like that, then it included D, but then when it came to assessing each company, but let's focus on D, instead of assessing inclusive of D within the set, you assess D relative to the frontier formed by the rest of the companies. Then the red arrow here shows you a distance between D and the frontier formed by the rest of the companies. And so if you were to say to companies, so if you were to assess the efficiency in that way, the theta, the efficiency of D, would be OD, divided by OF. That would be greater than 1. Greater than 1 it would be. So therefore, here now you would have a positive factor. And in the formula, instead of asking for a reduction in the observed cost, you'd be permitting a certain increase that you can control by rho. For example, you can say 0.2 for rho here. So that you say, well, if you exceed by 10% the efficient frontier, so you're 10% more efficient than the best of the rest, you'll get a revenue which is another 2% above what your costs have been. If you did that, then the company has an incentive to be as super efficient as possible, to go further and further up in order to get a higher and higher incentive. So that's the idea in this sort of approach. So that is already an existing approach. And what we did in our paper is we simply wanted to extend this idea to include even more companies within the limit of those from which efficient practices are to be revealed. So imagine that you solve this standard DEA model, which is here under constant returns to scale. It's an output-oriented model. You are maximizing phi, the factor by which the observed outputs of a given company that you are assessing, company P, maximizing the output levels that it could give you, subject to its observed cost. So essentially, you're projecting all the companies to the efficient frontier. So you're eliminating artificially from the data inefficiency. So now you get a data set in which you have the outputs set to the efficient level. So in terms of the graph that we were looking at earlier on, they're all on that efficient frontier. If you did that, then one way in which you can include more companies, but not the one that we are suggesting, one way in which you could do is you can, across the whole system, you can set up a model that minimizes the aggregate cost all the companies would be permitted to incur in order to deliver their output levels. So the model is estimating, assuming all the companies have efficient output levels, what would be the cost per unit that you could permit the companies so that the aggregate cost across the system is minimized, but no company, J, is allowed a cost which is less than the cost it actually did incur with its efficient output levels. Graphically, what that would do is, in this particular graph, it would draw an efficient frontier that would be just this line EB. It would sort of envelop the efficient frontier from below. And you could go this way. All these companies now would be incentivized. All of these companies would be incentivized now because they would be exceeding the benchmark EB. However, the negative side is that there's too many of them. So your standard is too low. You have too many companies that are super efficient. And you're not setting an efficient enough standard for the rest of the companies. So you want to improve on this. And one way you can do it is to try and envelop further from below, closer to the DEA efficient boundary, but not all the way. So if you imagine that instead of having, I'll go back one again, instead of having a single efficient line here, that you permit more than one efficient line, so you can come closer like that, for example, then what you could do is you could modify the model I showed you earlier. So you're still having the efficient output levels, so you're still dealing with the efficient output levels of the units, and you are minimizing the aggregate cost like we were doing before across the whole system. However, now you are permitting different unit costs per unit output, so that in effect, you give each company J the option through this 0-1 variable delta for the company to be allocated to one of K clusters that you, or think of it as K, capital K, different frontiers, different, instead of a single line K equals 1, you would have K equals 2 if you wanted to just draw two frontiers to get closer to the DEA efficient boundary, or K equals 3 to get even closer, and so on. So graphically, that would look like this. And what this does is, first and foremost, it gets closer to the efficient frontier. So you get a higher standard. The negative is obviously you have different benchmarks for different units, but that's no stranger to evaluating by DEA. If you're going to be assessing by DEA, in fact, you have many facets, efficient facets. So this reduces the number of efficient facets, but it doesn't reduce them down to a single one. And the other thing it does do, which is attractive, is it finds more, it gives more incentive. If you look at higher super efficiency, would be for units that are sitting at a sort of central point, which means they are central point to the frontier rather than to the edges of the frontier. That would mean these are units that are referent units for many others, rather than those that show a sort of more extreme sort of behavior. I'm looking at my watch as I go along. I hope I still, I'll be stopping in the next 3 minutes or so. So that's the idea of this model, that we have the incentives formula that I mentioned earlier, where if you remember, you give a company a revenue target that is such that it is giving it an additional percentage of its observed cost if the company is somewhere there above this threshold lines that you have drawn. It's subjective how many threshold lines you draw. So if I show you an example of how this works, we run it in the paper, you will find the full example, where you have 4 branches of a bank in Germany, that the branches are controlled by the center in the sense that the policy directions are set out, but each branch, and then the branches are given a budget, but each branch has its own way of operating, so they have autonomy, so to speak. And so you have total expenses as the input, the budget, in other words, and then you capture the activity level by looking at how many deposits they handle, how many loans, how many other assets they manage, including interest-earning assets. And in this data, if I go to this end, where it says k equals 400, that's just to say that this is the standard DEA. In a standard DEA where you assess by without assessing for super efficiency, you have no unit with an efficiency above 1%, and therefore, so your average efficiency, let's say, comes to this just under 80%, the median percentage, and therefore the model would say the system should deliver cost savings across the system, across all companies, of about 21%. Companies are saying.
In 10 minutes, sorry to interrupt you.
Sorry, I should stop at this. Okay, let me just observe this here then.
A few minutes, you have still 5 minutes, maximum 10 minutes.
Oh, no, I won't need that much, don't worry. Okay, so that was the standard DEA. Now let's come to what I've been presenting today. If you go to the one where you have a single line enveloping the efficient frontier from below, that's one cluster, k equals 1, you would find in this particular data set some 65 units, that's 16% of them having a super efficiency, that's over 1%. And coming here to the bottom, you see that that would mean you require a saving of about 14% rather than 21%. So the rest, like just about 7% of the total expenditure is given as incentive. It's you could have been recouping it as a system, but you're not. You're sort of giving it away as incentives. And then as you increase the number of clusters, if you go to 2, from 65 down to 26 only super efficient units, a dramatic drop. And obviously by dropping that, the benchmark has come higher. So you have, you require more than you did before, more than 14%, about 18.5% of the total expenditure to be delivered as savings, and you give us as sort of incentives about 5%. And you can see there's more of the same there. As you increase the clusters, you require more and more saving until the maximum estimated saving of 21%. So that's it. To summarize, both I suppose what Srini presented and I. Obviously, this is focusing on the use of DEA. DEA is not the sole method used for regulation, so we don't want to give you that impression, but it is one of the main methods. It's highly integrated into the regulatory systems of many countries, okay, especially in Europe. Essentially, what it does is it's an input to the system. It's not the be-all and end-all. The regulator takes the efficiency into account, uses other methods and so on, but it becomes part of the whole process. What I have focused on, already the idea of incentivization existed in some forms. It is already used, for example, in Norway. But the paper I presented is an extension of what's used in practice. So it's not practice, what I've just presented. It's an academic paper suggesting that what you could do, if I go back to the graph in order for this to, sorry, that's the wrong way, wrong direction. What it is doing, what we are presenting in our paper is, it's drawing, it gives control to the regulator to draw as many of these facets as the regulator feels deems it's appropriate, so that it can bring into the remit of companies that could give additional best practices, not just the ones that are on the efficient frontier, which is what the Bogethoft and Agrel papers had, but bring into the remit more companies, at the expense, of course, of setting the standard somewhat lower, and therefore, in the whole system, at any point in time, you'd be requiring lower savings that you might otherwise have wanted, but would like an investment in the system the more savings you give in at one run of the regulatory process, the more efficient practices will be revealed, and then you can set the standard higher. That is all I had. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions now. I don't know how this will work. Shall I go myself to the questions?
I think, Emmanuel, we'll go to the question at the end.
Okay, okay.
The session is not finished yet, so I'm going to continue this with the demonstration of the software, the PIM-DEA software that we developed. So I don't know if you can see which screen you can see. So the rest of this session will be, are you seeing my screen on PIM demo? Okay, so the performance improvement management software, the DEA software that is developed here, it can be used in any application of the DEA, but one application, of course, is which I'm going to demonstrate it is sewerage services, evaluation of sewerage services in England and Wales. I'm not going to details of the input and output selections, but in these applications there are a set of outputs, including resident populations, length of sewerage, area, capacity, and the operating expenditure has been calculated or estimated by Ofwat. Ofwat is the authority for the water in UK and in Wales. And this application is used on 61 sewerage districts related to 10 companies. If you would like to see details about the input and output, I refer you to that paper of the manual at the end of this, as you can see here. So we put this data in an Excel file. Let me see what is there. I'm just loading the Excel to show the Excel file. I assume you see the screen, which I got the Excel, yes? Okay, so in the Excel, you can see that we have a few sheets. The first sheet is the main sheet, and that includes the information about the DMUs. In these cases, we have, as I said, we have 61 districts, belongs to 10 different companies named A, B, C, etc. And we have a data that's been collected on different periods. So each period of data can be saved in one sheet in Excel. The way that PIMs work is that, let me close this as well. No, sorry. I need to load PIM software. So once we start the PIM, we can import the data to the DEA software. So we start the new project in PIM, import data from Excel. And this is the data set that I say with here. So as you will see in this data, we have one main sheet which identified the DMUs and then the periods of the data that we have. The Excel could have other data still or other sheets, but we don't want to import them to PIM. So once you import this data to PIM, you will see this data in a spreadsheet format type of here, like period 1, period 2, etc. With information about the companies in A, B, C, D, which each of the DMU belongs to. The way that PIM software works, first of all, you have some information about the variables. For example, you can get the summary statistics of the averages, variance, minimum, maximum of each variable, just to check if you like. You can also produce the production possibility set, the PPS. In this case, we have, just for purpose of demonstration, let's take two outputs, area, for example, and yeah, and the length as an output, and input, for example, which is in this case the operating cost. So as you will see, this unit, for example, D3, the D2 and the H8 are efficient. So this is for period 1. You can change it to each period and change the period as well. But also you can see 2 periods at the same time. So, and if you specifically focus on one specific unit, say for example H1, and you choose H1, then you will be able to see how the H1 can be projected to the front here on each period. Given that very limited time that we have, I'm going to start one new model and call it model 1 or M1. The way that PIM works, you initially, once you start the model, have to define the input and output. Say, for example, the operating cost is the input, and I choose again 2 output for demonstration purpose, but of course there are 4 outputs here to choose. And once you selected input output, and if you simply run the model, it will run it through all the periods and will produce the efficiency score. So the efficiency of each DMU, as you can see here, within each period is easily can be seen. You can also see the efficiency trend, for example, for each period. If you focus, for example, on each company, then or each district, for example, you see how the efficiency is changed from one period to another period. You can also see the efficiency plot. All these plots are exportable. You can get a screenshot or just export them to the Word file if you want. But on top of those, other information such as lambdas, for example, the peers can be seen. For example, in this case, D2 and D3 are the most popular DMUs that are meant to be peers to other DMUs. In fact, D2 has appeared 51 times, D3 has appeared 53 times, and H8 appeared 3 times as a peers to other DMUs. Once you have the peers, if you look on the lambdas, you can also get the value of the lambdas against the positive value of wherever the lambdas is positive, the peers appear to be peers in the decision-making units. The targets, slacks, weights, all of these are also being produced here. As I said, I do not have much time to explain all details. But obviously, if you have one model and you want to create another model, if you look on the property of this model at the beginning, we have constant return to scale input oriented. So by default, the model, once you start the model, it would be constant return to scale input oriented. But you can change it to output oriented. You can change it to variable return to scale. So if I change it to variable return to scale and I run this model, the result obviously would be changed because this time the efficiency would be based on the variable return to scale efficiency score. Once you develop a model, you can keep this model and create another model. So I simply copy model 1 to model 2 because I don't want to lose the information that is already been generated by model 1. And on model 2, I'm going to change some of the parameters. For example, I'm going to change variable to output oriented to input oriented. I'm also choosing Malmquist index, for example. This is a variable return to scale Malmquist index, so is radius the Malmquist index in this case. So by running this model 2 now, we have 2 models run at the same time. The result of the 2 models, you can see it. Obviously, when you're running the Malmquist index, it has to go to all the components of the Malmquist index and find all the component of the Malmquist index. So in this case, for example, technical change, scale efficiency change, pure efficiency change, etc. And all the components also been reported as well as the Malmquist index itself. If it's a variable return to a scale, the Malmquist index might be invisible, obviously, that are also shown here. There are many other features in the software, including, for example, category selections. If we want to run the efficiency or decision making, the DEA within each set of category, like for example, each set of companies in these cases is easily to do that. So if I says I want to run only for the company C, so I'm going to choose this company C only. Let's rename this for company C. and also want to run this for all companies. So if I choose all companies here, this basically will run DEA once for all companies and once for company C. So when you run model 1, so obviously it's go to various models to run it. So now we can see the efficiency within the company C because the company C is selected here. So, and then also all companies as you can see in here. This is for period 1, but then period 2, etc. All details can be found here. Other features of the software, including I/O priorities, period selection, of course, Malmquist index. We have Ray and Desley Malmquist index, I mean the variability and the scale. Also, we have circular Malmquist index. Super efficiency, as Emmanuel explained it, that in the model, the super efficiency can also be used here. Weight restriction is one of the very popular uses in DEA. Allocative efficiencies and bootstrapping all are implemented within the software. Unfortunately, we do not have much time to go through details, so I'm going to stop these demonstrations. Let's not save this one. I don't want to say what. So, but those who want the information about if you like more information about the PIM-DEA software, there will be another webinar on the 4th of November by OR Society that I'm going to present more details of the PIM-DEA software and some of the features, including bootstrapping and super efficiency, full Malmquist index, as well as circular Malmquist index, and other features within the software. If you like to register, you can register on that website in order to join that webinar on the 4th of November. As part of this webinar today, you can also download a free evaluation copy from the website of the deasoftware.co.uk/offer/ORS. And within that, you can use the software for 20 DMUs on a CRS VRS basis. Thank you for joining this webinar. We have about 8 minutes left for the question and answer. And I'll ask Emmanuel and Srini also to turn the video on. And so we start with the questions. So far we have few questions received. Let's see, what are the questions?
So are you...
I'm reading the questions, Emmanuel. I'm just looking to find the question. Yes. Quick questions. What are the newest trend and direction in development of DEA? Emmanuel, maybe if you'd like to.
That's a difficult one, really. If you're talking by trends as to where there's quite a lot of research activity going, I think probably network DEA would be one of the main areas, theoretically, where people are going. The other area, which again is open, is really this one of estimating efficiency ranges for companies, leading on from bootstrapping in DEA to go on to how to allow for noise in the data, because one of the main criticisms to DEA is that it assumes any distance from the frontier is to do with inefficiency, and that may not be the case. But it is, having said those two, really, it's just a very, very broad area. There are a lot of theoretical applications. Then in terms of the applications themselves, the ones that I'm most aware of are the ones in regulation and also the ones in the health area and education. These are the sort of three areas of massive applications that I'm aware of. Okay.
Okay. There was another question which seems to have been disappeared, asking how to validate the DEA score. And there are different ways I'm going to answer this. I don't know if Emmanuel or Shirley can add something later, but one of the ways that you can validate the DEA score is by simulations. There are many papers published using simulations. If you know the production possibility set, for example, if you can use Cobb-Douglas production or piecewise linear production possibility set to generate the data first, and then run the DEA model before applying it in real application. That's one of the ways that you can validate the DEA score.
I answered the question via the Q&A window, Ali, and I agree with it. So you can simulate some noise in the data to see how sensitive the results are. And I also mentioned that, well, clearly in regulation at least, or in real applications, people consider alternative model specifications, which may involve alternative, retentive scale assumptions, for example, or alternative proxies to capture some of the specific factors. And see the sensitivity of the results to alternative model specifications. One can also use alternative methods, right? So like SFA or econometric methods to see, how different the results are and if the two can be brought together. And again, in regulation, operational evidence can also provide a cross-check as to the DEA score.
Another question is that in which area DEA has been used most?
I think that would be regulation.
I think I just answered that regulation is one of the main ones. That the reason, I think, partly is because in some countries like Germany, actually DEA is mandated almost to be used among other methods. But elsewhere too, because it's an established system. Once companies have been privatized, big companies, in order to protect the consumer, you need to assess efficiency, and that's where the DEA is coming in. I'm trying to be brief so that other questions can come in.
Yeah, sure. There is another question that whether the PIM can handle the directional distance function. No, PIM cannot handle directional distance function, but we have I/O priority, which is very similar in order to set up a different direction when you want to target your the inefficient DMU to the frontier by setting different priority to the input and output and PIM. Let's see if any other questions. How can I identify, someone asked, how can I identify the nearest benchmark in DEA? Manuel, you explain a little bit about the regulation and benchmarking, so maybe you can.
The nearest benchmark in DEA, that very much hangs on how you define distance. What we traditionally look at is a radial sort of distance between the frontier of DEA and the unit that you are assessing. But nearest can also be defined in terms of the mix of outputs that a unit is using. So you could say, if I'm assessing, for example, let's move to police forces, let's say, in a country, and some police forces are dealing with cities and others are dealing with rural areas. Then the mix of crime they face, that's the ratio of, let's say, burglary to murder, would be different in a city compared to a rural area. So you may want to assess in terms of or in that case, the units, the police forces, being closer in mix of outputs to the company concerned. So it depends how you define the distance. Beyond that, I would say there are papers which are not necessarily easy to read that actually do assess, if you define distance in the Euclidean way, that's the levels of outputs. Maybe offline we can put some references there, but there is a way of identifying which are closer to a given unit. But the difficulty there is you need to define the efficient facet, and defining the efficient facets and then choosing the nearest one is not necessarily fun.
Thanks, Manuel. Thanks, Srini. Thanks, everyone, to join this webinar. Despite very nice weather, we stayed all inside.
It's only in the UK that it is nice at the moment.
Well, maybe other places as well. Yes, we hope that next year this conference, the OR conference, will be run at Warwick, and hope we will see many of you in the conference, either OR Society or other DEA conferences soon. Thank you for joining.
Okay, thank you everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yeah, you can enjoy the rest of the conference as well as the quiz tonight.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.